In today's episode, there will be discussion of human remains. So if you aren't in the right headspace for that topic today, please be kind to your mind, and I will see you in the next one. Today, we are going to be looking into a pretty unusual story, one that I'm not sure has much coverage, and that is the tragic death of Scott Williams. Scott Williams was a teacher, and he was only 35 years old when he was crushed to death by a garbage truck in July 2009, following a night out drinking with friends. I came across this story randomly on Instagram, and I immediately saved it because I felt like it was important to share this story to hopefully prevent a similar accidental tragedy. But before getting into the details of what happened that night, I do want to let you know about who Scott Williams was and what his life was like before his untimely end. Scott Williams grew up in Hamilton, New Zealand, and was described by friends, family, colleagues, and students as someone who was a fun loving type of guy, very kind and active, and he loved sports. And he was seen as an inspiration to so many, especially his students who absolutely adored him. His schoolmates that grew up with him in Hamilton, New Zealand, describe him as being very popular. And he was just this big, fun guy who loved everyone, and everyone loved to be around him. Scott was born and raised in New Zealand, but he did come to London, England in the year 2000 and spent time traveling around Europe before getting a job at Harrow High and Sports College. He returned to New Zealand in 2007, but ended up coming right back to London a year later and was working as both a math teacher and a rugby coach. I wasn't able to find too much information about his family or his upbringing, but I did find that his parents and sister were still living back in New Zealand while he was in the UK. But his brother Tony Williams was in London. But I wasn't able to determine whether Tony was there just visiting his brother or if he was also living there. But he was in London, England during the time of Scott's unfortunate and very, very tragic death. Scott was planning on staying in England due to a new relationship, and also he was just loving his life in London. It was seen as sort of a fresh start for him. And according to Lannon Durant, one of his friends back in New Zealand, Scott had been seeing a woman for a few months now, and apparently it was getting more serious. And he also had just become a British citizen. So it seemed that Scott was happy with his life and where he was at. But sadly, Scott's life was cut short due to a devastating incident. The story begins on a weekend night in July 2009, where Scott had been out drinking and pub hopping with either a friend or multiple friends. I've seen it reported both ways. It seems that most articles reporting on this incident, most of them are saying that he was out with a group of friends. So I'll likely be referring to them as a group or the people that he was out with, but he could have just been out with one friend. It's really unclear. But regardless, Scott had been to several pubs in the Brighton area and was enjoying his night out until around 3 a.m. when he was last seen leaving the final pub. And it's unknown why Scott left the pub and why he didn't leave with the people that he was with that night, or really what happened when he left the pub at 3 a.m. It's not known whether he left with someone or if he left on his own. But, anyways, at some point in the night, Scott found his way into an industrial size trash container, or a wheelie bin, as they say in Britain. And many theorize that in his intoxicated state, he wound up in this wheelie bin to sleep it off. But sadly, Scott didn't make it out of this bin alive. In the early morning hours, the bin was scooped up by a trash collection truck, or a lorry as they call it in Britain. and its contents were then dumped into the lorry's crusher or trash compactor. And it's unknown whether Scott was conscious when this happened, and I truly hope that he wasn't, because his body was completely crushed in this trash compactor, and his remains were found at a waste recycling site in nearby New Haven on Monday morning. Fairly soon after the lorry emptied its load, the workers there made the gruesome discovery that someone had died. And this would have been so traumatic for the workers who come across his remains. And I can't even imagine returning to work after making such a discovery. But sadly, Scott's strange death is not an isolated case, as it nearly happened to two other people earlier that year. Two unnamed people who were sleeping rough, which is British slang for a person who is unhoused or unsheltered. Two people nearly met the same fate as Scott. They narrowly escaped death after sleeping in a communal or business wheelie bin, and following Scott's death, the community called for urgent action for an increase in safety checks because apparently there had been cuts to the refuse budget, which resulted in nobody being employed to check the bins to ensure that nobody was inside a bin before emptying it into the trash compactor. If these budget cuts hadn't been made and there was somebody whose job it is to safely uh, dump, the refuse into the trash compactor, Scott would likely still be here today. One theory or possibility that I want to bring up is whether or not Scott climbed into the waste bin on his own or whether he was put there by someone else. While most of Scott's family and loved ones have accepted that his death was accidental and simply a mistake that he made while intoxicated, others are not so sure. Many feel that even while drunk, they just don't believe that Scott would have climbed into a trash bin. However, I would imagine that most people, if they found out that their loved one died in such a way, it would be pretty difficult to imagine them doing that. However, when you are in an intoxicated state, there is a risk that you make choices that you wouldn't make sober. And due to the state of his remains obviously being crushed to death by a trash compactor, there really is no way to determine any foul play. The timeline of this case is also kind of all over the place because some reports say that the last time anybody saw him was at 3 a.m. on Sunday, while others say it was 1 a.m. And we're also mainly relying on reports of people who are out with Scott this night. And these people who were with him on the bar crawl were probably also intoxicated. And so it's kind of unlikely that their reports are going to be accurate because when you're out drinking or, having fun out with friends, it's pretty rare that you're checking the clock. It's usually not something that you do when you're out, especially on like a pub crawl. And so it's really difficult to really nail down a timeline for this case. And there is also no mention in any of the articles that I found reporting on the case whether or not there were any surveillance cameras around the area that picked up anything. But this was back in 2009, and so it's kind of understandable that there wouldn't be, despite Brighton being a very popular location in England, and I've heard that it's a place where many tourists like to go, and also for the people who live there, it's also, a pretty popular area, and so it's kind of surprising that there weren't surveillance cameras, but it is 2009, so, not outside the realm of possibilities that there wasn't. Another thing in this case that is very unclear is whether the bin's contents were collected by the lorry on Monday or Sunday. And Scott was reported missing by his friends at 8 a.m. on Monday, an hour after his body was found at the recycling place. But it's unclear whether he actually died on Monday or whether he died on Sunday. It's just there's no way to know. And according to many of the articles covering the story, the recycling company is not even sure which exact bin he was in, what street he was picked up on, or which day. And so it definitely makes you wonder whether or not he put himself in the bin or perhaps someone else put him in the bin following foul play. And sadly, we probably won't ever know what happened. This story is really a cautionary tale of safety while you are out and making sure that after a night out, you have a safe way to get back home and just making sure that you're taking care of yourself and the people around you. I hope that Scott's loved ones were able to find some kind of peace and closure despite not having all of their questions answered. I can't imagine having heard the news that someone I loved was crushed to death by a trash compactor and just the not knowing of what exactly happened. It's just such an unthinkable tragedy. And it's even more depressing when you think that this possibly could have been prevented. But what do you think about this story? Do you believe it was simply an accident, or do you think there is more to the story? Thank you for listening to this Stranger Than Fiction story, and be sure to tune in for the next bizarre true crime story. But with all that being said, thank you for listening. Be safe, and I will see you in the next one.